In this video, we'll be talking about an important part of tort law, and that is trespass to land. So what is trespass to land? As I said, it's part of tort law, and tort law is, of course, part of the common law. And when we say trespass to someone's land, what we mean is that that person that's trespassing is interfering with someone else's land without authority. So if they did have authority, then it wouldn't be considered as trespass. But because they don't have the authority, and that's when it will be considered as trespass. Remember, when we're talking about land, it's not just the physical land itself, so not the soil itself, but it also includes any fixtures on the land, so such as buildings, trees, etc., and also the airspace that's above the land itself. Now, of course, airspace, it's not unlimited airspace. There are certain heights that would be applicable. But the thing that we need to understand is that we're not just referring to the soil itself, but it can include, any fixtures on the land, the airspace, and the subsoil as well. So the ground beneath the surface of the soil. When you're in the legal possession of a land, okay, so when you are the person that gives authority to others to use your land, you can either be defined as a landowner, hence you're able to give that authority, or a lessee. What's a lessee? A lessee is basically someone that rents the land. So someone that um, has an agreement with the landlord that they can utilize that land, and they have this agreement as in the form of a contract, and hence they pay rent for their use. So if you're in a legal possession of land, you are the person that gives authority. If you don't give authority to someone, then that person, if they do use your land, if they do sort of, even if they just walk across it, that would still be considered as trespass in law. And for that, you can sue that individual. Now, when it comes to suing people that are trespassing on a particular land piece that you own, there's certain things that we have to understand. So, what would be required from the plaintiff and what would be required from the defendant in these cases. The plaintiff needs to prove that there was a direct interference with the land. There is no need to prove damage. So this is a main point, because when we talked about negligence, you had to prove that there was damage, and the damage was a result of the breach. Over here, if you sue in trespass, you don't have to prove a damage. You just have to prove that there was a direct interference with your land. Now, in return, the defendant needs to justify the interference. So why did they interfere? They need to justify that. An example of a justification would be they acquired the legal rights, maybe to use the land, and they have proof to indicate that. If, however, the plaintiff desires to claim damages rather than an injunction, so in most cases that involve trespass, it's just an injunction that the court would order, so they would stop the defendant from using or trespassing. But if it is certain damages that the plaintiff claims, then the plaintiff needs to prove that there was physical damage to the land, or they need to prove that the defendant denied them beneficial use of their land, and hence they lost because, let's say, for instance, they didn't acquire the rent or the income that they had specified for the use of that land, and they can hence claim for damages. When I said, trespassing, I mentioned that you need the authority to interfere in order for you to be considered not a trespasser. So what do we mean by interference, and how do we get the rights, the legal rights to interfere in someone else's land? You can see on the screen there are three main points. Easements is the first point. So this is where you obtain a non-possessory right to use someone else's land, where you can enter onto their property or use it to, say, gain access to let's say for instance, water mains that are located in their lands because they have an issue on your piece of land. It's more of a permanent thing, and that's how, because a lot of people confuse easements with licenses, and licenses is the second point that I have on the slide. The thing that differentiates easements from licenses is the permanent nature of an easement. What is a license first? A license is a permission that's given to do a particular act or a series of acts on another's property, and the license itself can be revoked at any time. For an easement, it's different. You can't just revoke an easement. If you issue an easement, if you allow someone else to use your land as per the easement that you'd provided them, you can't just revoke it whenever you wish. If you say it's a 2-year period, you can't revoke it before the 2-year period ends. However, for a license, it's different. You can revoke it at any time. The third aspect that allows you, or that gives you the legal right to interfere in someone else's land, is if you're trying to avert disaster. So if it is for the purposes of maybe putting down a fire that's near your property or near your land, you have the legal right to interfere, and you wouldn't be considered as trespassing, even though you don't have the authority to enter. Let me give you some examples of what would be considered as trespass to land in the common law, or in law generally speaking. If you walk through someone else's land without authority, that's trespass. If you're driving through someone else's property or land, that is trespass. If you have objects that are leaning on your neighbor's wall, so let's say for instance you have a ladder, so the ladder is located on your property, but it's just leaning on someone else's wall on an adjacent property to yours, again that would be considered as trespass. If you've got rubbish on your property and the wind blows the rubbish towards your neighbor, again, that would be considered as trespass. In construction, and that's where the area that we're interested in, a lot of the cases related to trespass, they are associated with cranes. Because as I said, trespass to land doesn't just involve the soil, the physical soil itself, but it also involves the airspace above the soil. So if you erect a crane on someone else's land without permission, of course, that would be considered as trespass. But even if the crane itself, if the boom of the crane enters the airspace of an adjacent property, and you don't get the permission of the neighbor to do so, then that would be considered as trespass. So you have to have consent whenever your crane is going to be sort of interfering in the airspace of nearby properties. You have to have that consent from the owners of the nearby properties. If there are repair works that you want to undertake, let's say a water main that goes through an adjacent property, you can't access that water main unless you get consent. A situation takes place where the neighbor refuses to give you consent. What happens in this instance? Well, in this instance, the court would still classify that even if you go in after you try to convince them, to give you consent, if you go in, it wouldn't be considered as trespass, like in the full sense. And a case that demonstrates that is the one that you see in front of you on the screen. What happened in this case? In this case, basically, there was a tower crane that was erected, and the boom of the tower crane was going through the airspace of an adjacent property. Now, the plaintiff tried to obstruct the defendant from utilizing that airspace, even though the defendant had approached the plaintiff on several occasions and they wanted to pay them a certain amount of money, but it was just that in an unjustifiable fashion, the plaintiff was refusing. In this case, the plaintiff was refusing to give consent. Now, the court over here in this case found that this wasn't justifiable, it wasn't reasonable, and even though the defendant had committed a trespass, it was logical that consent were to be given based on the conditions as to the payment that the defendant was willing to pay for the plaintiff. But the plaintiff, because they kept on insisting on refusing to issue that consent, it wasn't found to be logical to do so. So the court allowed the project to continue on, and then after the project was over, they charged the defendant with trespass.